So we're gonna go about for what, about an hour?
Yeah,
No, sounds good.
I've already begun recording. So it is a wonderful honor to welcome Massimo Pigliucci to the podcast. He is the professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. And in this hour, we are discussing his new book, The Quest for Character, What the Story of Socrates and Alcibiades Teaches Us About Our Search for Good Leaders. Massimo, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've been wanting to discuss Socrates for some time, and you're the perfect man for the job.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start by asking, how does Socrates influence our conception of politics?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we think in terms of ancient philosophers and what they had to say about politics, usually it's Plato that comes to mind, not Socrates. And of course, part of the problem in distinguishing the two is that Socrates actually never wrote anything down. So everything that we know about Socrates comes from Plato or from a few other sources. Another one of Socrates' students, Xenophon, wrote down several dialogues, some of which actually have the same titles as the dialogues that were written by Plato. But so it's difficult to actually separate exactly Socrates from Plato. This is what scholars refer to as the Socratic problem. That is, where does Socrates end and where does Plato begin? Nevertheless, there's some triangulation we can do on the basis of the available sources. For instance, it's more likely that the real Socrates is reflected by whatever the Platonic dialogues have in common with those of Xenophon, as opposed to where Plato goes off on different on a different tangent in a different direction. Also, scholars think that Plato wrote his dialogues, of course, for over a long period of time. Some of the dialogues are so-called early dialogues. Then some of them are kind of a middle period and then late dialogues. And you can see that the figure of Socrates changes throughout these dialogues. So the general idea is that the early dialogues, like the Apology, for instance, are more reflective of what Socrates actually said and thought. And then the middle dialogues, like the Republic, start to be kind of intermediate, where it's much harder to distinguish Socrates from Plato. And then the late dialogues, like the Laws, for instance, Socrates either doesn't appear at all or it becomes a minor character. And then at that point, you can be sure that what you're getting is in fact Plato's opinion and not Socrates. So all of that said, to answer go back to your question, what is it that Socrates said about politics? Well, he had a very hands-on sort of approach to politics. He basically thought that a politician should be a wise person, that he should practice philosophy in the broader sense of the term, not philosophy as an academic discipline, as I do when I teach at City College, but philosophy as a way of life. Because if a politician or an inspiring politician does not practice virtue, and in particular one specific kind of virtue called practical wisdom from the ancient Greek tradition, then that politician is bound to do bad things. It's bound to really do things that are not good for the polis, for the society at large. Practical wisdom is one of the virtues, and it's the virtue in particular that deals with knowledge of good and evil. So, in other words, the idea is that if the politician doesn't have a clear moral compass, basically, a way to clearly separate what is good from what is not good, then it's going to be trouble. So for Socrates, politics was inextricable from philosophy. If you do politics without philosophy, you're in trouble. Not only you're getting in trouble yourself, but you're getting in trouble your constituents, so to speak, the people that you're doing politics for. That is a position that was then later on articulated in more detail by two other major thinkers of antiquity. Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, also thought that engaging in politics from the point of view of from a philosophical perspective is one of the best things that one can do. One of the best uses of your time is actually to get involved in politics, because politics, broadly construed, is important, is crucial to the working of societies. If without discussing what we want to do within the polis, that is within the society at large, then there will be no society. And then later on, arguably the major Roman philosophers and statesmen, Cicero, did the same thing. He in fact practiced very much, unlike Socrates and Aristotle, who actually never got themselves into politics. They only advised politicians and statesmen. So, Cicero actually got himself into politics. He actually, at some point, was the consul of the Roman Republic, which was the highest possible political office in ancient Rome. So he actually practiced what he was preaching.
So many people might be familiar with Socrates, but I'm not sure as many people would be familiar with who Alcibiades is. So tell me, who was he and what was his relationship with Socrates?
Yeah, you're right. Many people had never heard of Alcibiades, which is really strange because I keep being surprised at the fact that, as far as I know, at least, nobody has made a movie or a Netflix series out of the life of Alcibiades. Alcibiades was this incredible character that was larger than life, who lived at the same time as Socrates. It was about, so we're talking about the end of the 5th century BCE. Alcibiades was about 20 years younger than Socrates, and in fact, he was a friend of Socrates and a student of Socrates. And Alcibiades was this kind of character that had it all. He was impossibly handsome, uber rich, brave, brash. He was very successful with women and men alike. He was like incredible. And he had, of course, an incredible amount of ambition also. He wanted to make a mark in history. He wanted to lead Athens as a general and as a politician, as a statesman. So at some point, he goes to Socrates when he's very young, when Alcibiades is very young, goes to Socrates, and the two have a conversation, which is recorded in one of the Platonic dialogues called the Alcibiades I or Alcibiades Meyer. And it's a very interesting conversation. In fact, the second book of the second chapter of the book starts out with with bits of that conversation. And basically, Alcibiades says, "Look, I have all these things. I have good looks, money, power, and all that. I want to make a difference. What do you think?" And Socrates basically sits him down to a job interview. And he starts asking, so, okay, if you were in fact in charge of things at Athens, what would you do? How would you act? And why, and especially why would you do it? What would be your motivation? And it's clear a few minutes into the interview, into the dialogue, that Alcibiades is not really up for the job because his motivations are the wrong ones. He doesn't want to be the leader of Athens so that he can do good for the people of Athens, that he can actually improve, their living and put them on the path of peace and everything. He wants glory for himself. He's a narcissist. And so he wants to be famous for the sake of being famous. He doesn't really care about other people. And therefore, he lacks that kind of practical wisdom that I mentioned a minute ago. He doesn't really know what is truly good and what is not good. He thinks that what is good are things like fame and glory and money. And he doesn't realize that actually what is good is to act virtuously and to be helpful to other people. And so on that basis, at some point, Socrates in dialogue says, my dear Alcibiades, the problem is you're a fool. You really don't know what you're talking about. And in fact, it is because of people like you going into politics that things are often problematic in Athens. And in fact, if you do decide to go into politics, disaster is going to ensue. And Socrates, of course, was right because we know historically what happened. Alcibiades, of course, ignores Socrates' advice. He does get into politics because he's so charming and charismatic. He actually does get elected general, and this is right at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and and Sparta. So Alcibiades makes all sorts of decisions that are good for his glory, but bad for Athens. The big one being that he convinces the Athenians to open a second front in the war, and he convinces them to go to Sicily and to attack Syracuse, which was a Greek colony at the time and was a very, very, very powerful city. And the Athenians do that, and they are completely and utterly defeated. The Athenian fleet is destroyed. Tens of thousands of Athenians are either killed or enslaved. And that was the beginning of the end of the Peloponnesian War. But Alcibiades' life is kind of a complete fulfillment of Socrates' warning, because not only Alcibiades leads Athens into disaster, but his own personal story is one of a disaster after another. At some point, he gets accused of impiety, that is, of disrespecting the gods, and in Athens, and so he flees to Sparta, to the arch enemy of Athens, and he starts advising the Spartans on how to defeat the Athenians. So he basically betrays his own country. But then when he's in Sparta, what does he do? He thinks it's a good idea to seduce the Spartan queen, and not only he seduces her, but he gets her pregnant. Obviously, the Spartan king does not appreciate that kind of thing. And so now the Spartans are after Alcibiades, and he has to escape Sparta. Where does he go? He goes to Persia. Persia was the arch enemy of both Sparta and Athens at the time. And he starts advising the Persians. So he basically betrays twice over, not just the Athenians, but the Greeks in general. Despite all of that, he actually at some point manages to get himself recalled to Athens. And because he's brilliant, he's put again in charge of the war, of certain aspects of the war. And he actually does manage to win a string of battles, but then he loses one, he's put into exile again, he flees one more time, and finally things catch up with him. When he's fleeing up in the mountains in the interior of Greece, he's actually surrounded by probably Spartan, maybe a combination of Spartan and Persian soldiers, and he's finally killed. So it's a tragic story, but it's a story of hubris. It's a story of lack of wisdom. It's a story of narcissism. And it's a story that I think tells us a lot about actually modern politics, because we do see a good number of narcissistic, hubristic kind of people getting into modern politics and wreaking havoc as a result. We are, I believe, in the about to see something like that happening again in the United States, because we're now looking at a presidential election in which at least one of the two candidates is certainly a narcissist, hubristic narcissist, and we'll see how that plays out. Hopefully, better than it did for Athens.
Yes, here's hoping. I'm reminded of Lincoln in his early address, the Lyceum, I think, on the perpetuation or preservation of our institutions. President Lincoln warned against the ambitions of men and the need for secure institutions to be a guardrail against them. So pretty much relevant to the situation with one of the aforementioned candidates for president and certain institutions of American politics designed to curb that ambition. But
right, that's right. But the problem is that institutions are resilient only up if they're well designed, they're resilient, but they're resilient only up to a point. I mean, Athens also had institutions, and it had an assembly, it had sort of some kind of checks and balances. Arguably a better example actually is the Roman Republic. I mentioned Cicero earlier, and who lived near the end of the Roman Republic, near the end of the first century, before the current, the Common Era. And the Roman Republic is actually a better model even than Athens. We tend to think of Athens as the origin of democracy, which is true. It was one of it wasn't the first democratic city. There were a few other cities in Ionian Greece, closer to what is today Western Turkey, that actually had democratic governments before Athens. But Athens is the one that clearly developed it and put it on the map. So it's right that we do think of the birth of, the birthplace of democracy as being Athens. However, in terms of modern democracies, with the checks and balances of different branches of government and that sort of stuff, modern democracies are actually republics. That is, they're based on a constitution. There are checks and balances. There's certain rights that are guaranteed, and so on and so forth. That kind of model is actually closer or more closely based on the Roman Republic than on Athens. In Athens, people simply voted by a simple majority. So if the majority of the people in the assembly decided that Socrates needed to be put to death, he was going to be killed. And sure enough, that's, of course, what happened. In Rome, there were different branches of government that kind of checked each other. There were elections that were essentially by tribes. So the Roman people were divided into regional areas. Each area would vote as a block. So it was something far closer to what we have today in terms of, especially in the United States. And so the Roman Republic, it's actually an even better example. Now, the problem is that even though the institutions of the Roman Republic had survived for several centuries, like 500 years, and which is much longer than the American Republic at the moment, right? And even though they were well thought out, they evolved over time, they were modified and improved over time, at some point they did collapse. And they collapsed under the stress that was put on those institutions by outsized figures like Julius Caesar. And Mark Antony and eventually Octavian, who became the first Roman emperor. Cicero realized, who was very much influenced by Socrates, he realized what was happening. Essentially, he said, the problem with institutions is that they work so long as people actually assume that there is a certain way to behave, and that way to behave is followed by most people, especially politicians, especially people with power. But if people start ignoring the institutions themselves, if they start trampling the institutions, and this becomes sort of a normal way of acting, then there is no institution is strong enough to actually withstand that kind of pressure. And modern commentators, plenty of contemporary commentators have pointed out that this is exactly what's happening in the United States right now. We just saw the State of the Union by President Biden last night, and he was heckled and booed by his Republican opponents. That did not used to be the case. The presidential address, the State of the Union, used to be a very somber kind of thing where people respectfully disagreed, and they applauded or more or less enthusiastically, but there was respect. There was no such a thing as calling names, calling the president names or heckling or booing or anything like that. And that's only one example of how. There was, for instance, just a couple of days ago, right before the presidential address, I saw on one of the major American television networks, people calling for the Republicans to block Biden from actually appearing and giving his State of the Union. That is something that is unprecedented. I mean, a Congress that actually is asked to consider the possibility of stopping the president from doing something that presidents have been doing for a long time. So those kinds of things are situation, and of course there are bigger examples like the insurrection after the last elections, right? So when you get to that point, now you begin to see the cracks in the institutions, and that's exactly what Cicero saw, and that is why. He warned future generations basically about these kind of things. Now, I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I'm not suggesting that the American Republic is about to end like the Roman Republic did, but there is a concern. That is, we cannot just rely on the institutions. That's why I wrote a book called The Quest for Character. We cannot just rely on the institutions. Institutions are absolutely important, and they need to be well designed and updated with the situation as the situation evolves. but institutions can only do so much. We still need to rely on people actually buying into those institutions and actually behaving in a more or less virtuous way, with, and therefore being characterized by a decent sort of way of looking at things and acting on things. Otherwise, no institution is going to be resilient enough to avoid catastrophe.
Now, I brought up Lincoln's address because I think that for anyone who wishes to pursue political office, either in a democratic regime or a non-democratic regime, some ambition has to play into that. Nevertheless, what is to stop his or her ambition from running amok, like I suppose, well, let's just say its name now, Trump.
Yeah, we've been kind of playing around with the name of the character in question. So I mentioned one of the virtues that arguably is the most important one, the practical wisdom, as opposed to theoretical wisdom. Theoretical wisdom is kind of an understanding, a general understanding how things work. So it's a theoretical, somebody who has theoretical wisdom has a good grasp of how the world works, right? And that's of course important. That's something that you do want. But practical wisdom is I would say even more crucial, because it has to do, as I said, with the knowledge of what is good and what is not good. Now, the ancient Greco-Romans also recognize a number of other virtues. 4 of them were supposed to be so important that they're referred to as cardinal virtues. One is the one that I just mentioned, practical wisdom. The other 3 are courage, justice, and temperance. Temperance is the one we're talking about here. That is, a good leader, a good person in general, but a good leader in particular is temperate. Temperance is about self-control. It's about knowing when something is too much or too little, for that matter, right? So doing things in the right measure. And so, as you say, yes, you probably will not have somebody who runs for office, especially in the modern environment. But frankly, even in ancient Rome, it wasn't. Even then, it took a lot of money and it took a lot of energy and it took a lot of doings in order to run for office, just like it does today. So yeah, unless somebody has a certain amount of ambition, one doesn't do it. But the point is, where is that ambition directed, right? If it is the ambition of doing the right thing and helping people and making this a better world, absolutely, that is the kind of person we want. But if it is the ambition of making money for yourself and fame and obtain material advantages from your position, then no, that's the wrong kind of ambition. Then your ambition is directed in the wrong place. So the problem isn't necessarily ambition in itself. The problem is, well, what's the drive motivating your ambition? Why are you ambitious? Why do you want to do certain things, right? And again, that goes back, therefore, to the notion of practical wisdom. You have to know what the right thing to do is. If you don't, then you're just a narcissist, and you're therefore dangerous if you have a certain amount of power and influence.
Now, going back to the example of Alcibiades, he's clearly a classic example of a charismatic demagogue. Of course, that's a word that is Greek in origin. And
Right.
of course, an analogy can be drawn between Alcibiades and Donald Trump, even though his physical attractiveness is, they're not on par with each other, so to speak.
Yes, Alcibiades was much more attractive.
Uh, but what makes figures like Alcibiades and Trump so attractive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the book, at the end of the book, I actually blame ourselves at the end of the day for these kind of things, because it's easy to blame people like Alcibiades and Trump, right? Say, oh, look at those people; they're non-virtuous, they're narcissists, they think just about themselves and so on. Yeah, but we are the ones that vote them. We're the ones that put him into power. Both Alcibiades won elections in Athens, right? So he was elected general and leader of Athens. It's not like he was a tyrant. He didn't take over, by force. He was actually welcomed by the people. And so, of course, has been Trump. Of course, you can argue that he actually lost the popular vote the first time, the only time that he was actually elected. But that nevertheless, he was legitimately elected in 2016. And it looks like now he's the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, which means that there is a large number of people, at least among Republicans, that are voting for him. So at the end of the day, it's not that difficult to understand why there are narcissists around or sociopaths around. But that's just the nature of things. If you look at, psychologists will tell you that a certain number of human beings are going to be pathologically narcissistic and pathologically, uh, with that kind of sort of pathological ego. The real question is, why do these people exercise so much influence and convince so many people to vote for them, to support them, right? And that's a complicated, issue in and of itself. To some extent, it does go back to sociology and psychology. Psychologists have shown for a long time now that there are certain kinds of personalities among the sort of the general public, the general people in general, that are referred to as authoritarian, meaning that they prefer to have a strong authority to tell them what to do and what not to do. Often, fundamentalist religious people, for instance, are authoritarian in that sense. Authoritarian not in the sense that they want to be in charge, but in the sense that they prefer a very strict hierarchy with somebody, with one person at the top that makes decisions. This is just a human psychological trait. We all have it to different degrees. And if you have it to a high degree, then you fall into what psychologists call an authoritarian psychological profile. Some of us don't, many of us don't, but many of us do. And that explains not only the Alcibiades, to some extent, it explains not only the Alcibiades and the Trump of history, but also the Mussolini or the Hitlers and so on. I mean, Mussolini and Hitler both, again, won elections initially, right? Before they became authoritarian and dictatorial, they actually did win elections. So it's something that we've seen over and over in history, and it's something that we expect to see again, because there is this issue of certain number of people sort of responding to an authoritarian way of looking at things. But that's only part of the answer. An additional part is the propaganda, right? It's the effect of propaganda. Propaganda is something that we tend to think of propaganda as invented by the Nazi and by, under Hitler, and, he had a whole ministry of propaganda, Goebbels, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, they were just reinventing something that had been going on at least since the ancient Greco-Romans. Julius Caesar engaged in propaganda, in what we would today call propaganda. He was putting out fake news, essentially, a spin on things so that people would look at things the way he wanted to look at them. I mean, in his case, of course, the specifics were different from what we would do today. Like, one of his major bits of propaganda is that he convinced a good number of people that he was actually descendant directly from the goddess Venus, right? Now, today, that wouldn't work. Not many people would buy into a politician saying that he is the son of God or something, or at least a descendant of God. But it's the same kind of general idea. That is, you spin things and you present an image of yourself that has nothing to do with the facts. Obviously, Julius Caesar himself probably did not believe that he was a descendant of Venus, but it was useful for political purposes, for propaganda purposes. And we see the same thing today with politicians frankly, of all stripes, spinning things always the way in which they wanted them. But again, it's a matter of degree. I mean, it's one thing if you are a more or less normal politician trying to put a positive spin on the facts because you want to push things in a certain direction. That we all do that, but that's not. But then there is the pathological version of it. Then there is people who literally make up stuff as they go, and we know this because we can fact check him. There's a whole cottage industry devoted to fact checking Trump, and he has lied or made up stuff literally thousands of times over the last few years, and people keep calling him on it, and he keeps doing it, and he keeps doing it because it works, because he has he has been very effective in undermining the public trust of standard institutions. We were talking about institutions earlier, right? So what I think one party certainly has done in the United States over the last several years, and this is before Trump, this is at the least it goes back to the onset of 24-hour news channels, and especially the start of Fox News, so-called news. Fox News is essentially a propaganda machine. Hitler would have loved to have something like Fox News at his disposal because it's very effective. Hitler would have also loved to have the internet at his disposal because it's incredible, and social media in particular, because they're very effective at spreading lies, and or even worse, half-truths. Outright lies can be detected, and if you pay even a little bit of attention, you can figure out. You can check them. But half-truths are even worse because there is a little bit of lies, there is a little bit of truth, there is just enough truth to make it credible, and then at that point you don't know what's going on, and you cannot. So it used to be that the public in general would rely on certain gatekeepers, as they were called. For instance, mainstream media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, things like that. These days, if you say, I read this in the New York Times, a lot of people would say, oh, that's a propaganda, that's a leftist newspaper, even though there's pretty clear evidence that it's not. It's actually right in the middle of the political spectrum. There are leftist magazines and newspapers, but the New York Times is definitely not one of them. Nevertheless, we've gotten to a point where a lot of what used to be mainstream, or sometimes referred to as legacy media, are simply not trusted anymore. We have, our politicians, some of our politicians and propagandists over the last few decades have achieved a remarkable result. They have essentially demolished public trust in a lot of institutions. If you look at polls, the Supreme Court has a very low degree of trust, like I think it's 18% or something like that, which is abysmally low. Congress itself has a very low degree of trust in the general public. Mainstream media have a low degree of trust. So when all of that is going on, then who do you actually trust? Right? And people tend to gravitate toward whoever tells them what they want to hear. So it's complicated. It's a matter of, it's a combination of psychology, sociology, organized bullshitting. I'm using the term bullshit in the philosophical sense of the term, not just in the colloquial one. There's this wonderful book that came out a few years ago called On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt, who was a philosopher at Princeton University. And he said, he distinguished bullshitting from lying. He said, somebody who lies has to actually know where the truth is, because you're not going to be an effective liar unless you actually don't actually know where the truth is, because you want to stay away from it in a symmetrical fashion. So even the liar, in a sense, Frankfurt says, has a certain respect for the truth. But the bullshitter doesn't. The bullshitter is somebody who just puts together all sorts of stuff, some of which is true, some of which is false, some of which is made up, some of which is kind of in between, because he has an agenda. He doesn't care about truth or false per se. He just has an agenda. He wants to convince people to do his bidding. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, is a quintessential example of a bullshitter, and it's working, as you can see. He has convinced millions of people of things that even a few years ago would have been unthinkable. Right?
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the Trump phenomenon, I always go back to Julius Caesar, not the figure, but the play. It's one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I think of the third act where, after Caesar dies, Brutus tries to convince the people of Rome that Caesar is an ambitious man. So, in other words, a wannabe tyrant. And Mark Antony takes his turn in speaking, and he has a very powerful speech he was venerating Caesar. And I think by the end of that act, the people of Rome preferred Antony's speech over Brutus.
Right.
And because I travel in like conservative circles, I can see the analogous to people like Brutus and people like Antony um, in within this circle. So the Brutus figures are those who prefers to defend the Republic against people like Trump, and the
Right.
people like Mark Antony. An example I can think of is, I guess, Michael Anton. Yeah, so same initials, who who draws from a wealth of intellect and philosophy to defend people like Trump. And for the most part, the people who are fans of Trump, they love people like that. So tell me about the role that the figure of Mark Antony plays in I suppose, the apology or the defense of people like Caesar or Alcibiades and I suppose Trump.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And actually, I agree with you that the Julius Caesar is one of the best plays by Shakespeare, and that in particular, those dialogues are just masterpieces. However, I have been reading recently a number of modern scholars. There's a new book that just came out, for instance, on Cicero. Cicero plays a minor part in the Shakespeare play, and in fact, he's presented as kind of a weak character, and he's given a very rather few lines and things like that, even though he was the main opponent of Julius Caesar, as it turns out, and a major help, in fact, to Brutus. So some modern scholars are actually blaming Shakespeare for the popularity of the figure of Caesar, and for the bad reputation that people like Cicero and Brutus actually have. Brutus has gone down in history, of course, like the guy that betrays his friend and kills him, and as opposed to the freedom fighter, as opposed to the guy who actually was trying to oppose the tyranny, what was evidently becoming a tyranny. So it's kind of interesting. Shakespeare's play has really been of an outsized effect over the centuries. It has reverberated over the centuries in terms of really shaping the way in which a lot of people think about all those characters. Now, back specifically to Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a son of a bitch. It was a very interesting kind of character. He was obviously a very valiant and very effective soldier and general. I mean, from that perspective, just like Alcibiades was. Yeah, in fact, there are lots of similarities between Alcibiades and Mark Antony. Both of them kind of greater than, larger than life kind of figures. Both of them into physical pleasure. Mark Antony famously was drunk half of the time and was having sex the other half of the time with a bunch of different women. But he was very effective as a commander in the field and as a soldier. He was not very articulate. We're told by the ancient sources, unlike Shakespeare, that he was actually not very articulate. And in fact, what we know, what we can reconstruct, there is a very interesting recent biography by, I think, Catherine Tempest of Brutus. It's called Brutus, the Noble Conspirator, where the normal script is kind of turned around. As it turns out, the ancient sources tell us that Mark Antony was not very effective initially after the death of Julius Caesar in convincing the Roman citizens that to go on the side of the Caesarian party. In fact, he had to run away from Rome. I mean, initially he was in kind of bad shape, and he lost a couple of major battles against the Republican forces. So, history has been it was on the brink of sort of turning things around dramatically. And in fact, we know that Brutus gave a very effective speech shortly after the death of Caesar. The problem was of a completely different nature, according to our best understanding of how things went. And also, in fact, according to Cicero's own testimony, Cicero wrote a lot of letters to his close friend Atticus at the time as events were unfolding. And so we kind of have a behind the scene commentary, play by play commentary by Cicero, which was not meant for publication. So this is not one of his orations that were kind of, polished and all that. These were letters that he was writing as events were unfolding to his lifelong friends. So it's kind of an interesting view behind the scenes of things. And one of the things that Cicero does is to point out the major problem with the whole conspiracy. That is, Brutus and Cassius, in Cicero's mind, had done the right thing. They had stopped a tyrant by using extreme means. But, when the situation is extreme, then the means have to be proportional. But they did not have a plan for the aftermath. They kind of assumed that once the tyrant is out of the way, things are going to go back to normal. That, the Republican institutions, we were talking about institutions earlier, the Republican institutions would reassert themselves and then things will go back to normal. And Cicero says that was the fatal mistake of the conspirators, that they did not actually plan for what happened later. And one of the interesting things that Cicero said, Cicero was not himself a bloodthirsty kind of person. He was actually very averse to physical violence, even though he had military experience. And as I said before, he had been consul, which was not only the highest political office, but also the highest military office in Rome. So he knew about violence, but he was averse to violence. For him, violence was the last resort. Nevertheless, he chides both Brutus and Cassius for not having killed Antony, because he realized very quickly that it was Antony that was the problem, that he was left alive, and he was the one that was steering a lot of pro-Caesar sort of sentiments. And then what happened was the wild card. Octavian showed up, right? Octavian was the adoptive son, turned out to be the adoptive son of Julius Caesar. Nobody knew that until the last will and testament was read. And Octavian was a young boy. He was like 17 or something like that. So nobody took him seriously, including Mark Antony. Initially, both Cicero and Mark Antony made the same mistake. They did not take Octavian seriously. And it turned out that this guy was actually far more charismatic and far more, savvy than anybody had actually predicted. And sure enough, not only initially he aligned himself and allied himself with Mark Antony in order to defeat the Republican forces, which he did. Eventually, of course, he turned on Mark Antony himself and got him out of the way and became the first Roman emperor with the name of Augustus. So it's a really fascinating story, no matter how you look at it and how you slice it. But the figure of Mark Antony is these days presented in a way that clearly distorts the historical record, and part of it is because of Shakespeare. Shakespeare had, for dramatic purposes, it worked great for Shakespeare to do that. But that's always the danger of you should never look at a play, or in modern times a movie or a television series that is set historically as a documentary. It's not a documentary. It's not meant to be a documentary. And so if you get your perception of historical events from a play or a movie, you need to be really careful. There are examples even today, right? If you want to go and see Napoleon, for instance, the latest movie, you should definitely do that. It's an interesting movie visually and certainly with great acting, but don't take it as an actual portrait of the historical Napoleon, because it isn't.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I saw that and I agree. So going back to Socrates, some of the most notable of the Socratic/Platonic dialogues feature Socrates in dialogue with the sophists. I'm thinking of people like Protagoras or Gorgias or Callicles. Unfortunately, because we don't have surviving documents or texts written by these sophist characters, they have a bit of a disadvantage in defending themselves. But from what we know, who were the sophists and why did Socrates dislike them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We do have some fragments of, for instance, from Protagoras, but yeah, you're right. Most of what we know from the about the sophists comes from Plato, and Plato clearly disliked him. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Although even Plato himself, for instance, says very clearly that Protagoras was a nice guy, that he was a good person, and that he tried to do his best. He just disliked the kind of approach that the sophists were having. One interesting way of looking at these sort of diatribe between Socrates and Plato on the one side and the sophist on the other is explained very well in a biography of Plato that was published recently by Robin Waterfield. Robin Waterfield is a translator of ancient Greek literature, and he wrote a biography of Plato, which is interestingly the only modern biography of Plato that it's been put out there. You would think that there would be much more. But in that biography, Robin does approach the issue of the sophists, and he puts forth an interesting explanation for what was going on. So we have to remember that these are events that were unfolding near the end of the 5th century BC, so before the current era. And at the time, philosophy was very new. The so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, people like Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and so on, they lived 50 years earlier. And some of them actually, often the sophists themselves are considered pre-Socratics, but in fact, they were living at the same time of Socrates. Usually they were a little older than Socrates, but we're talking, therefore, the birth of philosophy itself, as we understand it in the Western tradition, was only about 50 years earlier, before Plato wrote. That's one thing to keep in mind. So philosophy itself was a very new thing. And writing was a new thing. The widespread ability of writing and reading was a new thing up until very shortly before Plato. Things were mostly in terms of presented and passed on in terms of oral tradition. Think of Homer, for instance, right, and Hesiod and things like that. Those were the poets that had dominated early Greek history, and their stuff was transmitted by oral means, not by written ones. So those two things combined, the novelty of philosophy and the novelty also of the written tradition, really pit two very different ways of doing philosophy against each other. Arguably, there were more than two, but these two that we're talking about, sophistry and, let's call it, philosophy proper, in the way in which Plato understood it. So what Plato was doing, so what Robin Waterfield is saying, and I think he's right, is that what Plato was doing is essentially he was fighting against an alternative way of doing philosophy. He was staking his territory. He was saying, look, this is not the way to do what the sophists are doing is not the way to do philosophy. This is the way to do philosophy, what Socrates is doing. Right? There was a third way of doing philosophy, which I should mention, and that is what most of the pre-Socratics were doing. That's what we refer to today as natural philosophy, or the ancestor of science. So if you're looking at most of the pre-Socratics, the ones that I just mentioned, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Thales of Miletus, Heraclitus, Parmenides, all of those people were actually interested in natural phenomena, in explaining natural phenomena. So they were interested in what we today call science. Okay, they were talking about the nature of the cosmos, the nature of reality, that sort of stuff. It was Socrates on the one hand and sophists like Protagoras on the other hand that moved away from natural philosophy and focused their attention on politics and ethics. That is, on the human condition, on actually philosophy that actually is relevant to human affairs. Those were the first two to do that, and they were, of course, in competition with each other, right? So you can understand a lot of what's going on between Plato and Socrates on the one hand and the sophists on the other in terms of competition. Now, that said, there were actual differences. The sophists were really more into what we would today call rhetoric than philosophy. That is, sophistry was about the art of persuasion. The sophists famously went around saying that they could, for a fee, they could teach people how to convince others of whatever they wanted to convince them, right? That's rhetoric. It's not philosophy as we understand it today. So it's not about a search for truth. It's about a search for good arguments to convince other people, to persuade other people of your point of view. What Plato and Socrates were doing, on the other hand, was they were interested not in persuading. Socrates doesn't really persuade a lot of people in the Platonic dialogues, right? A lot of the Platonic dialogues end in what is called aporia, that is a state of confusion where people say, I don't know. The point, the goal of Socrates was to pursue truth, and particularly to show people, to show his interlocutors that they didn't know as much as they thought they did, right? When one of Socrates' friends went to the oracle at Delphi, which, by the way, Delphi is the picture that is behind me. That's from the temple of one of the temples, Temple of Athena, the Delphi. When one of Socrates' friends went to Delphi and asked the oracle, who is the wisest man in Greece, the answer was Socrates. And when Socrates was told about this, he was puzzled. He said, what the hell is the god talking about here? Like, I'm not wise. And then eventually he realizes that what the oracle meant was that the kind of wisdom that Socrates had was that he realized that he didn't know a lot. In fact, that he didn't know much at all. And that people, many other people in Athens, on the other hand, they thought that they knew quite a bit. And then it turns out they actually were confused, were actually ignorant. So this so continuous dialogue, and in a sense critical dialogue between the Platonists on the one hand, if you want to put it that way, and the sophists on the other, was really about competition for the meaning of philosophy. The sophists did consider themselves philosophers. And so it was for the meaning, is philosophy about search for truth, or is philosophy about persuading other people? And that was the thing. And clearly Plato won, because we tend to think today of philosophy as a type of inquiry into the truth about both human affairs and the nature of the world. And sophistry has evolved into rhetoric, into the kind of things you do as a lawyer, not as a philosopher.
Now, I'd like to end on this note. Let's bring back Alcibiades into this. Because I think that the dialogue that reveals the most about who Socrates, at least in the eyes of Plato, was, and who Alcibiades was, is the Symposium. It's one of possibly the most beautiful and the most relaxed of the Platonic dialogues.
Yep.
So from the conception of love proposed by the various participants in that dialogue, of course, Socrates and Alcibiades included, we get to know not really what the true philosophy of love is, but who the characters are based on their views of love. And of course, Alcibiades showed up, I think, in the second half of that dialogue, completely wasted, so to speak.
Yes.
Of
course.
Tell us about the philosophies of love proposed by Socrates and Alcibiades.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right. The Symposium is one of my favorite Platonic dialogues. It is more relaxed than most, and it's fun. It includes, among other things, a beautiful story by Aristophanes, the playwright, the comedian, about the origin of love, and it's a mythological story, and it's beautiful. It's just like where it explains, so to speak, in a poetic mythological sense, our concept of soulmates. Why do we feel so strongly that some people are really made in order to complement us? But the crucial part of the dialogue, you're right, is near the end, where first Socrates takes up the floor, and then eventually Alcibiades crashes the party and delivers his own monologue. And the opposition is very clear. I mean, the contrast is very clear between Socrates and Alcibiades. They're both using the word eros for love, right? And now, of course, which is, of course, the root of the English word erotic. So we tend to think of eros as physical love, as sex. And that's definitely the way in which Alcibiades takes it. He actually, in fact, tells us in the symposium that he really wanted to have sex with Socrates, and he tried multiple times to do so, and he never got there. He was always rebuffed because Socrates was not interested in physical love. He was interested in sort of the higher level. Socrates gives us this explanation, which he tells us, by the way, he got from Diotima, a woman who was teaching him early on in his life, which is one of the very few cases in Greco-Roman history and philosophy where we actually have a woman that is credited, in this case, with teaching Socrates himself. And Socrates says, look, of course, eros begins naturally with a physical type of attraction. But then we are human beings. We're capable of reason. We don't stop. We're not just animals. So we don't stop at the physical. There's nothing wrong with the physical love, by the way. This is not a situation where Socrates is kind of prudish and he says that we should abstain from physical. He's very clearly a physical guy. In fact, at the end of that dialogue, he's the only one that still stands, despite the fact that he has drunk all night like everybody else. He still stands, and he gets up and goes out into the marketplace, and that is his usual day. So Socrates was a very physical kind of person. In fact, Alcibiades himself, in the same dialogue, tells us that Socrates was also a valiant and very sturdy soldier that saved Alcibiades' life. At least one occasion, possibly two. So this is not to be taken as Socrates telling us that we shouldn't be concerned with, that we should reject physical love. But what he's saying is that eros of that type is the lowest part of life. It's the lowest part of love because we share with other animals. In that sense, when we have sex, we're no different from other animals. Nothing wrong with that, again, but nothing particularly human about it either. What elevates us, what makes us distinct from the rest of the animal world is that we also have reason, and we start therefore thinking of eros, of love, in more and more abstract terms. We start by appreciating, long-lasting love is not just the one that is based on lust for the other person, is the one that begins to appreciate the character of the other person, the ability of that person to do certain things, to act in a certain way, right? So when we fall in love, which is the next step, we go from lust to actual love. We don't fall in love just with somebody who is physically attractive. Physical attraction is only plays up to a point into the equation. But long-lasting love is about the inner characteristics of a person, not about the outside experience, because outside appearance eventually fades. Of course, we all get older and we all get less attractive with time, but love can actually increase over time if the person is a virtuous person, if it is a person that does things and acts and behaves in ways that are actually virtuous and amenable. And then there is the highest possible degree of eros, and that is love of beauty itself. So now we've gone from physical attraction to moral attraction, if you want, for a particular person, right? And then you do one more step and you get to love for the idea of beauty. And now you start seeing that this is actually Plato talking and not Socrates anymore, because we're talking about Plato's famous notion of the realm of ideas, right? This notion that there are these sort of concepts, metaphysical concepts that actually constitute the real reality, of which the reality that we perceive is only a shadow projected on the walls of a cave, to use Plato's own famous metaphor from a different book, Dialogue from the Republic. So it's this beautiful progression that Socrates gives us from physical love to moral love to love of beauty itself. And then Alcibiades comes in. crashes the party, and he brings everything back down to physical love because he says, I really wanted to have sex with this guy, and he just spurned me. And it's actually very poignant in a sense because Alcibiades, who is an older man at this point, he's in his late 30s or early 40s probably. So he's near the end of his life, as it turns out. He's going to be killed shortly thereafter. And it's kind of a sad thing because you see a man who has everything and potentially could be as successful as he wanted to be, and yet is sad because he couldn't achieve the one thing that in his mind was most important, which is to have sex with somebody who has a pot belly and was ugly and he had an ugly nose and all that sort of stuff. So it's a beautiful dialogue. It's a beautiful interaction between the two.
Well, on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Professor Massimo Pigliucci of the City University of New York, for joining the show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.